what is your emergency? My wife was shot. Your wife has been shot? She's been shot.
Prior to this footage, the people in the vehicle you're looking at had actually just kidnapped a paralyzed woman, and she's in the van with them. And yes, this is obviously horrible, but when you peel back the layers, it's just not even remotely as simple as it seems. There's insane twists, details, and history here that I think will leave you feeling very confused. Despite the complexity of this case, I've actually never once seen it covered on YouTube, and so when I came across it, I knew I had to share it with you guys. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. The neighborhood of the Villages in Central Florida isn't exactly known for violent crime. It's one of those perfectly manicured retirement communities. In fact, it's the largest retirement community in the entire world. There's fountains, golf carts, palm trees, and the lowest crime rate in all of Florida. People live there for peace, and that's why what happened in July of 2006 inside one of these homes sent shockwaves through the entire area. At the center of the story is a woman named Sheila Miller. At the time, she was in her late 30s and recovering from a serious car accident that had left her partially paralyzed. She used a wheelchair and had recently moved back in with her elderly parents, James and Diana Miller. To the outside world, this might have looked like a family pulling together during a hard time, but beneath the surface, it was a bit more complicated. See, Sheila had a long and troubled history. Court records would later confirm that she'd been arrested for things like identity theft and forging her father's signature on checks. Her parents had even taken legal action against her before, but family ties being what they are, James and Diana still allowed her to live under their roof, despite the damage that she'd done previously. Of course, a large part of this would be her paralysis, but again, family being family, they most likely hoped that she could use this as a base to turn herself around. She would have to agree not to bring any negative people around their house, and as someone with a history of addiction, she was also expected not to drink or use drugs anymore. But then came a phone call. It was July 21st in 2006, and Sheila picked up the phone and heard a voice that she hadn't spoken to in a long time. It was from an 18-year-old man named Pooney McGirth. I try to remain serious in these, but that has to be the wildest name that I've heard since I've made this channel, and he's not a good dude, so I don't feel bad. Anyways, Pooney McGirth was an old acquaintance of Sheila's, someone she'd known through Florida's drug scene. She'd also loaned him money in her vehicle in the past, and he said he'd heard about her accident and that he just wanted to stop by and bring her a gift. And maybe to some people this sounds like kindness, but this wasn't a reunion, it was a setup, and Sheila then gave him directions to the house that she was in with her parents. And so, later that day, McGirth showed up, and he wasn't just alone, he was with two other men. There was 19-year-old Gerard Roberts and 17-year-old Theodore Houston. Sheila greeted them at the door and let them in, and according to court testimony, it wasn't long before the situation turned incredibly dark. They almost immediately tied Sheila up in her bedroom. And interestingly, it's important to note that it's still unclear whether or not she expected that to happen, meaning maybe she was in on this whole thing. But whatever the truth is, what happened next changed her life and completely destroyed her family. Diana Miller, so Sheila's mother, was called into the same room. McGirth pulled a gun and demanded money, and so Diana, trying to defuse the situation, complied. She handed over some cash and tried to reason with him, but McGirth fired at her in the chest anyways. He then forced both Diana and James to lie down on the floor, to where he fired at them both once in the back of the head. Miraculously, Sheila's father James somehow survived this. He managed to pull himself up and stumbled outside to a neighbor's house to get help. His wife Diana, however, tragically didn't make it. She was pronounced deceased at the scene.
911, what is your emergency? My wife was shot. Your wife has been shot. She's been shot.
And while this was all happening, McGirth and his accomplices dragged Sheila into her parents' van and fled. But this wasn't some clean getaway. They took her on a bizarre and reckless ride through Ocala, Florida, forcing her to withdraw money from ATMs, driving to different stores, and trying to make use of the stolen cash. There's actually footage of nearly this entire chase, as well as CCTV footage that was captured of them pushing Sheila around, getting her to withdraw money. The chase went on for a while, and police would pursue this car as it was recklessly driving around Ocala. They set up undercovers that could chase them if the main vehicle was dragged behind. They had a vehicle trap at a gas station that the vehicle was approaching, and in front of it they had a spike strip that worked perfectly. And from there, one of these vehicles used this opening perfectly to execute a pit maneuver, which sent it directly into the gas station where other officers were waiting. This was insanely smooth, I'm not gonna lie. All three men survived, with a couple attempting to run off, although some were injured. In fact, one guy rolled out and landed underneath the vehicle, and he only survived because the back end of the van had landed on another car, and it was pinned in a way that gave him room. Sheila as well was completely okay, and this was obviously a massive win for law enforcement. As for the men responsible, Ronaldo McGirth was sentenced to death. He was actually the youngest person in Florida to be on death row at the time, though his sentence was later commuted to life without parole. Gerard Roberts also received life, and Theodore Houston, who was just 17 at the time, got 20 years. He has since been released. Now, here's where the case takes another twist, because despite being the one who got tied up and kidnapped, Sheila's role in the events did raise a lot of eyebrows. The state didn't charge her, but her father wasn't convinced that she was innocent. In the weeks and months after the attack, James Miller actually filed for a restraining order against his own daughter. That decision wasn't made lightly. After losing his wife and barely surviving himself, James clearly believed that Sheila played a role in bringing this nightmare to their door. Even if she didn't pull the trigger, she had opened the door. And again, I want to make this very clear, a lot of the stuff regarding whether or not Sheila was in on it is purely speculation, but clearly her role in inviting them in alone was enough for her father to file for a restraining order, which just adds another complicated layer to all of this. As for Sheila, she actually expressed remorse. In interviews and letters, she acknowledged that she should have never let McGirth into the house. She fully acknowledged that her choices played a part in what happened, but for James Miller, who buried his wife and cut ties with his only daughter, remorse was not enough. This was a case that never made massive headlines, which, given how many elements there is to it, I'm pretty surprised about. It's a kind of story that sticks with you, not just because of the brutality, but because of how deeply personal it was. A daughter invites evil into her parents' home, a mother is killed, a father survives but chooses to live the rest of his life without her. Every part of this is just horrible. It was 3 a.m. in Mount Druitt, a suburb in western Sydney, Australia. A local mall sat silent, stripped of the noise and movement it usually carries during the day, but yet, for some reason, in the sights of the security cameras, a young girl walks alone. She was just 13 years old, fragile, out of place, and terribly vulnerable. You see it and you just know something's wrong here. This footage would be the last confirmed sighting of 13-year-old Michelle Pogmore. 2 days later, on February 22nd, her body was discovered in bushland near Mount Druitt Town Centre Reserve, not even a full kilometer from where she was last seen. She was found partially clothed, with her white track pants and new sneakers missing and have never been recovered. Whatever happened to this poor girl the night after this event remains largely unknown, and her death, even now, remains unsolved. But there's a hell of a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. Michelle was bright, imaginative, and by all accounts, deeply kind. She loved to read and escape into stories and always talked about fairy tales. People remembered her. After a bike accident the year before, she ended up in the hospital where she spent time entertaining a 2-year-old in the next bed. Officers and community workers in Mount Druitt knew her from her youth outreach programs, and she made an impression, but she also struggled. She was a teenager just starting to find her way and sometimes hanging around older kids in the area. But still, it's not like she was a runaway or anything. She was deeply loved and her family was always looking out for her. The last time Michelle's mother, Kathy Nolan, ever saw her was the afternoon of Thursday, February 19th, 2004. Michelle had come home in a foul mood after school, but perked up when her mom gave her a new pair of pink and blue running shoes. She put them on immediately, and then she said she was going shopping at Mount Druitt. So that's exactly what she did. But when she didn't come home, Kathy reported her missing. Sometime in the early hours of Friday morning, so now February the 20th of 2004, Michelle appeared on the CCTV footage at the mall that I showed you earlier. She was dressed in a dark sweatshirt, white track pants, and those brand new shoes. Why she was there or what happened for the remainder of this Friday remains largely unknown, but we do know that on that night, so the night after this security footage was taken, she was seen at a street party in Bidwell, which was a community event tied to a CenturyLink youth program. It seems that nobody wants to give any details here, but someone on a Facebook page set up by her mom later claimed that Michelle got into an argument at that party, and if that's true, no one has stepped forward to clarify what happened. And after this party, so now nearly 24 hours after this security footage, she vanished. Her mother never saw her again, and no one ever came forward to give details on what she did earlier that Friday, the evening on the Thursday, or why exactly she left this party and where she went to. Michelle sadly would never be seen alive again. Her body was found 2 days later on Sunday, and the heat that weekend had reached over 45 degrees Celsius, leaving her remains too decomposed to determine an exact cause or time of death. Her pants and her brand new shoes were missing. Investigators managed to recover a DNA sample, but no match has ever been made. Without eyewitnesses or leads, the trial eventually went cold. Again, somebody had to know something, particularly about what happened at the party, maybe not afterwards, but nobody came and said anything. And yet, the Pogmore family never gave up. Kathy still checks in with Mount Druitt police every Christmas. She still brings a hamper to say thank you, and not because they found her daughter's killer, but because they just really cared when everything was happening. They really did try, and she's still hoping one of these visits will finally bring an answer. And digging deeper, there really is more that goes into this, and I'm going to tell you it now, but just a fair warning, I won't be going into any details at all, but yeah, it's rough. 8 weeks before the events that took place on this weekend, Michelle was sadly violated by a random man. She ended up in the same hospital that she was in for the bike accident previously. She told police that she did not know this horrible man, only that he was between 50 and 60 years old. It's unclear whether the attacker was ever identified, but police did investigate the case. Michelle was already on the radar of several community programs and officers who knew her personally, and people were trying to help her, but she still fell through the cracks, and it eventually resulted in someone unfortunately taking her life. And to this day, we just don't know where she went on February 20th. We don't know who saw her that Friday, we don't know who she was with, who might have picked her up, or who she trusted enough to follow. Was it someone from the party, or was it just someone from the streets that she spent time on? For some insane reason, the coroner never officially ruled it as a murder. He left open the possibility that it wasn't foul play, but let's be honest, a 13-year-old doesn't just end up in that situation. Even if it was some kind of tragic accident, how does that explain the missing clothes and the silence from everyone who was at that party? Relatively recently, New South Wales police launched a review of the state's unsolved homicides. So maybe Michelle's case does eventually get another shot. DNA technology keeps improving. Maybe a new sample gets matched, or maybe someone's guilt finally outweighs their fear. And maybe the reward money goes up, but clearly so far it just hasn't been enough. Michelle Pogmore has now been gone for longer than she was ever even alive. It's a brutal reality to sit with, and it's a long time to live with a secret that heavy if somebody does know something. Either way, she deserves far better than silence, and her family deserves the truth, and the person responsible, whoever they are, deserves to be found. I have seen a lot of people giving the mother flack because after she went through that horrible event, why was she ever allowed outside, and how did she not know where she was? But we just don't know all the details here, guys. It's so easy to judge, and the reality is a lot of troubled kids do just wander off on their own, and the parents do absolutely everything they can to prevent it from happening. We just don't know the specific details. Either way, this is just a terrible situation, and I really hope we can get to the bottom of this one day. It was a little past 6 p.m. on February 1st of 2017 in General Trias, Cavite, a city just south of Manila in the Philippines. In a country with nearly 40% of its labor force in informal or contractual jobs, industrial parks like the Cavite Export Processing Zone represent economic opportunity for many people who otherwise may not have it. For House Technology Industries, or HTI, which is at the center of today's story, that meant more business. It was one of the largest employers in the zone with over 13,000 workers, many of them hired through subcontractors. They made prefab housing units for export to Japan. Like many economic zone employers, HTI operated around the clock. There was 3 shifts. Inside those massive factory walls, there were machines, chemicals, polyurethane foam, and flammable adhesives. If something were to go wrong, this would not be the ideal location and environment for it. And at the start of the evening shift on February 1st, things were by all means very routine. Workers clocked in, the assembly line buzzed, but horribly around 6 p.m., smoke started to cut through one of the buildings. It was Building C, which was a large warehouse-style structure with wood and foam-based materials that were stacked throughout. And then, of course, there was fire, and it spread really fast. Multiple survivors later said it felt like the whole place was flammable. Flames reportedly ignited insulation panels and adhesive compounds, which turned the space into a death trap in minutes. Of course, panic set in, and some workers said alarms did not go off quickly. Others said exits were blocked or led to areas already consumed by fire. Some tried to smash windows or climb out through narrow gaps, and some didn't make it out at all. By 9 p.m., the fire had reached third alarm status. Emergency responders swarmed the site, but extinguishing the fire proved difficult due to the factory's size and the sheer volume of flammable materials that were inside. And apparently this wasn't officially declared under control until 6 a.m. the next day, which is 12 hours after it began. Initial government reports stated that over 100 workers were injured, some with third-degree burns, and 5 people later died from their injuries in hospitals, but here's where the story just takes a dark and strange turn. Right from the start, something felt off here. The Philippine Economic Zone Authority, or PIZA, which manages the industrial park, claimed no workers died during the fire. They insisted all personnel were accounted for, but that directly contradicted the reports from hospitals, labor groups, and even national news coverage. The Department of Labor and Employment later said that HTI violated basic labor and safety protocols, including insufficient fire exits and a lack of on-site medical capacity. Wherever you look, there was just different numbers being reported on casualties here, and there were serious red flags about the investigation, or rather, the lack of investigation. Media were blocked from accessing the sites. Journalists who tried to speak to workers were told to leave, and survivors later testified both to NGOs and in labor forums that they were explicitly told by HTI representatives not to talk to the press, and in some cases even to delete photos or videos from their phones. Labor rights groups like the Center for Trade Union and Human Rights described it as an outright attempt to suppress information. Adding to the concerns, hospital staff who treated victims of the fire alleged that several patients had been mismanaged. Burn victims weren't transferred to proper trauma centers quickly enough, and many were undocumented workers, employed under multiple layers of subcontractors, which made tracking them in the aftermath almost impossible even if they did try to. Labor rights organizations conducted their own counts of injured and missing. They claimed that not all workers were listed on official rosters, especially those employed informally. A national fact-finding mission organized by multiple unions and NGOs concluded there may have been far more casualties than reported, but without transparent access to HTI's employment records, these numbers were never verified. In fact, some people said that there were upwards of 3,000 people on site when this took place, and claimed that this may be one of the most lethal workplace tragedies in recent history, alleging that it was a gigantic cover-up. And again, even PISA never clarified or publicly retracted their claim that there was 0 deaths initially, even though it was proven untrue. There's just no transparency here about anything. A resolution was filed in Congress, House Resolution 747, demanding an independent investigation, but again, no public inquiry ever materialized. No executives were held liable, and PISA maintained its stance that HTI complied with safety regulations, despite clear violations documented by labor inspectors. And so the incident faded from the headlines within weeks. No one knows the real number, and some fear it may be incredibly high, but because of suppression, this disaster goes largely unknown. I actually had never even heard about it until a comment suggested that I look into it. The story may have been suppressed, but for those who survived the fire, and for the families of those who didn't, this didn't go away. It lingered very quietly, and this wasn't just an industrial accident, it was the latest in a long pattern of preventable factory disasters in the Philippines, where corporate negligence and weak regulatory oversight sometimes combine to create the perfect storm, and when the smoke clears, it's always the workers who are left behind. What happened inside that HTI facility on February 1st of 2017 was more than a fire. It was a tragedy that many believe was followed by a cover-up, and like so many other cases before it, it was largely just met with silence and a lack of transparency. In the small rural town of Scone, New South Wales, the start of a new millennium didn't really mark much change. Life there was quiet and unremarkable, and it was just the kind of place where routines carried more weight than anything else, and where a family moving into the outskirts might not raise any questions, especially if they kept to themselves. And this is exactly where Kate Hutchinson was living in early 2001. She was a mother of 4 different children, including her youngest, 16-month-old Leonie Astra Hutchinson. To those who knew Kate in passing, she wasn't especially memorable. She'd bounced between locations and was reportedly struggling financially, but there were no signs of violence or major incidents. It was just a woman raising her kid on a modest property in the bush. But over time, and very quietly, it was almost like her youngest daughter, Leonie, sort of just vanished. It seemed like she just stopped being part of the rare outings that this family took, and because of the obscurity of this family, no one outside the home even seemed to notice that little Leonie was gone. There was no search, no Amber Alert, and not even a formal missing persons report. By July of that year, the Department of Community Services had started receiving concerns about the Hutchinson family in a more general way, so they conducted welfare checks. At one point, an officer asked about Leonie specifically, and Kate claimed that she was being cared for by friends, that she was somewhere safe. And the department made notes, but without clear cause for alarm, the file was closed and no one pushed further. And for the next 2 years, Leonie remained unaccounted for, her existence fading from record. It wasn't until 2003, after another visit from welfare officers, that the silence around her started to look more ominous. Kate again refused to give a location or provide access to the child, and her answers were vague and elusive. Sometimes she said that Leonie was interstate, other times that she was being raised by people that were called to care for her, and just none of this made any sense. But what authorities found out and what really started to concern them was that no one, so no relatives, no friends or neighbors, had actually even ever seen Leonie since January of 2001. And so, in January 2004, nearly 3 years after this little one was last seen, police finally listed Leonie as a missing person. And that's when the real investigation began. Strikeforce Canuna was formed to dig into what had happened. Detectives began retracing the Hutchinson family's movements, talking to anyone who had known Kate, and searching for any trace of the toddler. But by that point, again, more than 3 years had passed, and records were scarce. No birth certificate had ever been filed, no medical visits had been recorded after her first birthday, and her last confirmed sighting was by a neighbor in early 2001. After that, nothing. Kate, who was by then living in an isolated property in Carr Springs, refused to cooperate. She insisted that Leonie was alive and well, but offered no proof. She said things like she's where she's meant to be and told investigators that they wouldn't understand even if she did explain. And by 2006, so 5 years after, authorities acknowledged publicly that they believed Leonie was likely deceased, but without a body or any forensic evidence, no charges were filed. Kate remained under scrutiny, but she walked free. But some years later, that all changed again. In 2013, during a renewed coroner's inquest, new details came to light. A police search of the Carr Springs property had uncovered a handwritten note that said, "Have good memories, my angel Leonie. I love you." And during the investigation, it also emerged that Katie Hutchinson was allegedly involved with witchcraft at the time of Leonie's disappearance. An inquest in 2013 heard that Kate had told a friend that she would be the bearer of a chosen child for sacrifice. So yeah, as bad as things already were, they were just starting to look even worse. Investigators also described a deep 3.5-meter shaft on the land, a well that had never been thoroughly searched. It was unstable, difficult to access, and potentially dangerous to excavate. But it raised serious questions, and during the inquest, one officer testified that the well was a possible disposal site for Leonie's remains, though no physical evidence had ever been recovered from it. And again, more friends recalled hearing her talk about Leonie in spiritual terms, referring to her as a chosen child and hinting at beliefs about sacrifice and divine missions, but none of it amounted to any proof. The inquest just concluded with a grim but non-committal finding, that Leonie was likely deceased and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were suspicious. That was it. But finally, in March 2016, so over 15 years since Leonie was last seen, Kate Hutchinson was arrested and charged with her daughter's murder. Oddly, the details here are also very scarce, but she was taken into custody at her home in Evans Head, New South Wales, where she now had been living alone in a modest apartment. I assume by this point most of her other children were probably adults. The charge followed years of investigative work, forensic review, and input from the state coroner's office. Prosecutors alleged that Kate had killed Leonie sometime in early 2001, shortly after they had moved to Carr Springs, which is pretty obvious here. Following her arrest, Kate appeared in Lismore local court where she was formally charged and remanded into custody. She underwent psychiatric evaluation to determine her fitness to stand trial. Authorities acknowledged that the case was complex. There was no body found, and much of the evidence was circumstantial, but the weight of the silence, deception, and unaccounted years had finally reached a breaking point. And really, that's where this stands. Since her arrest, no public verdict has been released, and the proceedings remain largely confidential due to mental health considerations and court restrictions. But what's clear is that Leonie Astra Hutchinson was failed, not just by one person, but by a system that couldn't or didn't see the signs until it was far too late. Her disappearance didn't spark headlines when it really mattered. This one just kind of blows my mind. Like, when you think of a girl that young being missing and nobody reports it for 3 years, it's just insanely dark. That's going to do it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed these videos, I upload videos just like this quite frequently, so definitely consider subscribing, but if not, that's okay. I also have 40 plus videos all filled with cases that I can almost guarantee you've never heard of, so at least consider checking those out. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you guys early next week.